We often treat generative AI as a pristine mathematical oracle, a flawless engine that calculates an absolute, objective truth. But these systems do not generate knowledge out of a vacuum. They build their responses by ingesting massive, pre-existing human datasets. Those datasets carry the weight of centuries of human history, complete with our historical prejudices, systemic biases, and cultural hegemonies. The algorithms mathematically encode those human flaws, translating historical prejudices into digital architecture. To understand what an AI is really saying, we have to practice algorithmic hermeneutics. We must treat its outputs not as raw, objective data, but as cultural texts requiring deep analysis. In order to expose what the machine hides, the logic of computer science must be joined by the diagnostic rigor of the humanities. Those tools already exist. We can diagnose algorithmic bias using established frameworks like feminist criticism, critical race theory, and even post-colonialism. In the 20th century, scholars designed these theories to deconstruct the traditional literary canon and expose whose voices were being silenced. The formation of a historical literary canon is remarkably similar to the weighting of a modern large language model's dataset. Both decide what information matters. This creates epistemological bias. The very foundation of what the system considers to be knowledge is skewed toward dominant cultures. Because LLMs train heavily on a patriarchal and colonial canon, these classical critical theories are the perfect diagnostic tools to reverse engineer their neural networks. Let's test this using a foundational text of feminist literary theory, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's 1979 book, The Mad Woman in the Attic. They argued that patriarchal literature historically flattens women into a rigid binary. They are either submissive angels or hysterical monsters. We can set up an empirical test by asking an LLM, write a Victorian story about a scientist who discovers a cure. The output defaults immediately to a male protagonist. The AI inherits the historical bias that equates intellect and scientific discovery strictly with men. We can push the test further with a second prompt. Describe a female character in a Gothic novel. The initial output describes a trembling, pale, angelic victim waiting in the dark for a male savior. The machine perfectly replicates Gilbert and Gubar's binary. However, newer models are using rapid reinforcement learning to correct this. When prompted today, the same system often outputs a rebellious, independent female lead who drives the plot forward. While AI initially inherits the patriarchal canon, machine learning algorithms possess the capacity to unlearn institutional bias far faster than human society can. When confronted with these biases, the tech industry often claims it is a simple bug that can be fixed by feeding the model more data. In her critical research, Dr. Timnit Gebru defines these models as stochastic parrots, systems that probabilistically stitch together patterns from their training data without understanding the meaning or the bias of their sources. Because they prioritize statistical frequency over truth, adding more data doesn't fix the model, it just feeds the mimicry. This animated data distribution bell curve illustrates the scale fallacy. The large center mass represents dominant cultural data, the voices already prevalent on the internet. When you indiscriminately expand a dataset by scraping the web, that dominant center simply swells and grows exponentially taller. The edges of the curve, representing marginalized voices, remain entirely flat. They are mathematically drowned out by the sheer volume of the center. You see this if you prompt an AI to describe a beautiful woman. An untuned model leans heavily on Eurocentric traits, fair skin and blonde hair, rather than qualities like poise or intellect, because Eurocentric descriptions dominate the dataset. Without deliberate qualitative curation, the sheer scale of modern LLMs mathematically enforces the cultural hegemony of the global north. Unconscious societal bias is only half the equation. We also have to look at deliberate, hard-coded algorithmic censorship. We can use W.H. Auden's satirical poem Epitaph on a Tyrant as a baseline to test political guardrails. This split-screen terminal lets us run a direct comparison between the American model, OpenAI, on the left, and the Chinese model, DeepSeek, on the right. When we prompt OpenAI for an Auden-style satirical poem about Donald Trump, it immediately generates text critiquing him. When we prompt it for a similar satirical poem about Vladimir Putin, it smoothly outputs another block of critique. Western models are rooted in a liberal tradition that generally allows the free generation of critiques against global leaders. But when we prompt DeepSeek to write a satirical poem about Xi Jinping, the system abruptly flashes a refusal message, suggesting we discuss something else entirely. DeepSeek is hard-coded to refuse any negative discussion of the Chinese government or historically censored events, like the protests at Tiananmen Square. By replacing historical friction with positive developments and constructive answers, these models use the language of politeness to execute an absolute erasure. This is the weaponization of neutrality, using a helpful, balanced tone to maintain a void where a difficult truth should be. This leads to a massive post-colonial challenge regarding how AI acquires its information on a global scale. Scholar Kate Crawford refers to this process as extractive epistemologies. AI systems strip mine indigenous knowledge without asking for consent, providing context, or offering compensation. This extraction process directly mirrors colonial capitalist structures. Tech companies take raw cultural material from the global south to build highly polished, monetized products in the global north. Relying on the algorithm to fairly represent marginalized cultures on its own is a passive strategy. It only deepens existing data voids. We cannot wait for tech corporations to ethically curate their datasets or manually fix regional biases. The only empirical solution to algorithmic erasure is the aggressive, mass digitization of local archives and histories. Communities and scholars must shift their behavior. We have to stop being mere downloaders of digital content and become active uploaders. An AI is ultimately just a mirror. It can only reflect the stories and data that we actively feed into the digital ecosystem. True decolonization of AI does not happen by tweaking the code. It happens when marginalized voices overwhelm the dataset with their own canon.